I've had the pleasure of knowing this man for quite some time because he worked along with my wife for HBO's Real Sports, and this man has covered a record 14 Olympic Games, ABC Sports, CBS, NBC Sports, now of HBO Sports, The Fight Game with Jim Lampley and Canelo Alvarez, and Triple G will be coming back to a television set near you on September the 15th. A couple of Saturdays live on HBO pay-per-view. Good to see you, Jim Lampley.
Good to see you, Rich. Pleasure to be here.
So this fight, after having done so many fights, Jim, where does this one rank for you, do you think?
It's the biggest one on the horizon right now. And, you know, I rise to a high level of expectation every time we have a fight of this impact and magnitude within the sport. This is the only fight that will take place this year between two of the top 5 or 6 names in the sport. They're arguably the 2 biggest names in the sport outside of the heavyweights, Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. Clearly that fight isn't taking place this year. So this, a rematch of 2017's biggest fight, is 2018's biggest fight. And it's an entirely different kind of confrontation because of the events that have taken place in the intervening 12 months. Last year's fight was a high-level sports event between 2 honorable competitors who actually kind of liked each other and respected each other. This is an all-out blood feud between 2 guys who don't have any use for each other at all, and the level of animosity on both sides probably will affect the nature of the combat in the ring and in unpredictable ways. It's hard to tell who benefits from the higher level of venom going into the second fight.
So the fact that Canelo got popped for PEDs adds what to this mix?
Oh, yeah. Well, by testing positive twice for performance-enhancing drugs, he managed to kick away the original scheduled date of May 5 for this rematch. That occasioned the need for a third contract negotiation between the 2 fighters' teams, and that contract negotiation was far more angry and discordant than that which had preceded it. It took a last-minute infusion of money from sources that still aren't 100% clear to the general public to get Golovkin to agree to terms for the second fight. He got a much bigger bite of the pie than he got the first time around. And, you know, once again, they don't like each other. They don't like each other for a variety of different reasons now. And that's an entirely different emotional context than a year ago.
What is your stance on the decision, the split decision draw of the previous
Well, the split decision draw was a terrible decision. I mean, I think an overwhelming majority of the ringside observers and an overwhelming majority of the audience, as reflected on social media, agreed that Gennady Golovkin was the logical winner of the first fight. But he didn't win the fight in the role of Gennady Golovkin. You know, he came into the fight as the most celebrated pure attacker in the sport and a guy with a spectacular knockout record. He beat Canelo, if you agree that he beat Canelo, and I do, with boxing skill and his jab. It wasn't the way he was supposed to win the fight. And that may have, in some ways, left the door open to the draw decision. But, you know, almost no responsible observer I know of believes that a draw was exactly the right call in the first fight. It seemed clear that Gennady won more rounds than Canelo.
Jim Lampley here on the Rich Eisen Show. And again, Saturday, September 15th, HBO pay-per-view, 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 Pacific, brought to you by HBO Sports, which also brings you the fight game with Jim Lampley. The sport outside of the sweet science you enjoyed covering the most would be what, Jim?
Outside of the sweet science, the sport I enjoyed covering the most, well, I had, you know, so many different experiences. I mean, you mentioned the 14 Olympics. I had a dozen years of hosting Wimbledon on HBO, and I love the very thin margins of competition in tennis, as evidenced once again last night by Federer's upset loss at the hands of the, number 55 ranked player in the world. That kind of thing happens more frequently in tennis than in any other sport. And I really learned to love that when I was covering it with Arthur Ashe, Billie Jean King, Martina Navratilova, Mary Kerlow. We had an amazing lineup of expert commentators working with me when we were doing that. I got my start covering college football at ABC in the 1970s, and I did have several years as the, quote, senior reporter for Real Sports.
Yeah.
And I've always liked, the graininess of the topical story and everything. So I couldn't really isolate any one thing. I've had a lot of lucky gigs.
So what was the first gig you ever had, Jim? What was the first one you
I was
covered?
chosen from a nationwide talent hunt in 1974 to go to work on the college football sidelines for ABC. But the very first broadcasting gig
Yes.
was to work on pregame and postgame radio shows with football coach Bill Dooley and basketball coach Dean Smith at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.
What was that like with Dean Smith, Jim?
I learned so many amazing lessons of life from Dean Smith, and there are things he said to me and lessons I learned from Coach Smith that come up virtually every day in my life.
Like what?
Well, I'll never forget in 1972, the first time I ever came to Los Angeles. The Final Four was here in L.A., and North Carolina was heavily favored against a kind of little-known Florida State team in one semifinal. And UCLA was heavily favored in the other semifinal against Louisville. And UCLA and Carolina had been number 1 and 2 all year long. UCLA had Walton. Carolina had McAdoo. Our question in Chapel Hill was, when McAdoo goes to the top of the key and shoots rainbow jumpers, is Walton going to go with him? And to make a long story short, a tremendous player named Bill Chamberlain, who had been the MVP of the Eastern Regional the week before, was 3 or 4 minutes late to the pregame meal at the Century Plaza Hotel, and Coach Smith calmly announced to the team that Bill wouldn't play the first half. And the team was psychologically discombobulated. Florida State went up by 21 points in the first half, and a second half comeback fell short. And after the game, I realized I was about to have to ask Coach Smith the first difficult question of my career.
Is it?
So in the interview, I asked him, I said, I was in the pregame meal. I saw that Bill was 3 minutes late. This was the national semifinal. Could an exception have been made? And Coach Smith looked at me blankly and said, tonight was one night. We coach every player for 4 years. And I think of that almost every day of my life. Seriously.
That it's one day in coach.
Tonight was one night. We coach every player for 4 years. That was the end of the subject.
You're getting emotional just bringing this up right
Well,
now.
I mean, I can't think of Coach Smith without getting emotional. And by the way, that puts me in the same category with all of the players who played for him.
Jim Lampley here on the Rich Eisen Show. Who's the biggest character
Biggest character?
that you ever came across? Either
Well, I mean,
broadcasting
look, I
with
could
or-
cite 1,000 of them, but I spent years working with George Foreman. And George Foreman is a larger-than-life human being with an incredibly complex mind. I mean, people think of George to a certain degree as a clown because of the way he built his second career. But George is a brilliant human being who, by the way, also taught me some life lessons at bad moments in my career. You say who's the biggest character? Clearly, there've been 1,000 of them.
Right.
But George comes to mind immediately.
And then, so that's covering and broadcasting with him, or what do you think?
Both covering and broadcasting with him, because I believe George is the most underappreciated heavyweight of all time for one reason.
Mm-hmm.
He won the legitimate heavyweight championship of the world 20 years apart as two different fighters and two entirely different human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of boxing. It's one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of all sports. And people don't give him enough credit for the panoramic change that was necessary for him to become the guy who won the second fight after losing the first one to Muhammad Ali.
Do you think if Larry Merchant was 50 years younger, he'd be able to kick Floyd Mayweather's ass? Jim Lampley.
Well, Mayweather is a backup counterpuncher, and Larry would be a pure attacker.
I love that answer.
Take your pick.
That's one of my favorite
Listen.
post-fight
Here's how
exchanges.
great that line was. Larry said, "If I were 50 years younger, I'd kick your ass." At about 8:30 or 8:45 Pacific on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
By noon the following day, you could buy a T-shirt on the Venice Pier with a picture of Larry's face that says, "If I was 50 years younger, I'd kick your ass." By noon the following day, fewer than 16 hours later, you could buy that T-shirt on the Venice Pier.
And there was no social media at the time. Pretty
No,
much
that's
that was
right.
going
But
on.
social media, one of the things I love to say is that no sport is as dramatically affected by social media as boxing. The entire story of Floyd Mayweather's career, particularly his epic financial arc, is a story of social media. And social media is a huge context for what will go on in the second fight between Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez.
How so? Walk me through that.
Well, a lot
Jim.
of the feud that's taken place since Canelo's positive drug tests has taken place on social media, both with direct contributions to social media by people like Golovkin's trainer, Abel Sanchez, and also indirect with people tweeting and sending around quotes that they read here and there or hear from the two fighters.
And the fight game with Jim Lampley airing Wednesday at 11 p.m. on HBO. New episode available on HBO Now, HBO Go, HBO On Demand, and partner streaming services. Why do you do this show, Jim?
Well, the fight game is an opportunity for me to make a personal statement about boxing. We try to tie it to big fights. So, for instance, there's one tomorrow night, as you say, on HBO, and then there'll be another episode that will air September 19, 4 days after the fight. And I'm the executive producer of the show. I'm the writer of the show. I'm the talking dog on the show.
Nice.
It's a great opportunity for me to provide something more of a personal imprint than I provide calling the fight and setting up Max Kellerman, Roy Jones, Andre Ward, whoever is working with me as an expert commentator. Because as you know, Rich, play-by-play is essentially a mechanical role compared to expert commentary, which is more of an interpretive role.
Well, I wouldn't say you're mechanical in that role,
Jim.
I mean, you certainly give your 2 cents.
That's
while
partially because boxing is such a subjective sport, and the kind of call we deliver is more impressionistic than, for instance, using something that's statistically based. When I was calling NFL football games, the primary task was to say 2nd and 9, 13 minutes and 10 seconds remaining in the quarter, and set up the expert commentator to do the replay. But in boxing, there are many situations where I'll provide what amounts to an expert comment during the course of a round, and Max or Roy might deliver what amounts to a blow-by-blow type comment if it's necessary within the flow of what they're doing. So it's a far more impressionistic kind of a call.
What's the most memorable NFL game you called, Jim?
There were quite a number of them, but the most memorable game in context of history, because it's been shown on the NFL channel and various other outlets many times, is that I was calling a game between the Green Bay Packers and the Cincinnati Bengals the day that Don Mikowski broke his collarbone and Brett Favre took the field for the first time. And I had had a conversation with Ron Wolf the day before, talking about why would he have traded a #1 draft choice to the Falcons to get a guy whom the Falcons had drafted in the 3rd round, Brett Favre. And Wolf was candid enough to say to me, said, I honestly believe this. The minute Mikowski has to come out of a game and Brett replaces him on the field, Don Mikowski will never be our starter again. And that was a highly prophetic statement. Following day, Mikowski broke his collarbone on a Tim Crumry tackle, I believe in the 3rd quarter. Brett came onto the field, threw a touchdown pass to a guy named Kittredge Taylor, who never again caught another touchdown pass in his NFL career, won the game for the Packers, and that began his streak of whatever it was, 200 some odd consecutive starts as their quarterback.
If I'm not mistaken, though, Favre's first completion was to himself. I think it was a batted pass that went back into his hands.
Probably batted by Tim Crumry.
So you
who had a habit of doing that kind of thing.
You called Brett Favre's first snap as a Packer, essentially.
He hadn't done much with the Falcons. I'm not sure he had ever actually gotten onto the field with the Falcons.
I don't think Jerry Glanville wanted him have any part of the field. That was interesting times for Favre.
Right.
Back in
Jerry
that
with
day.
his cowboy boots.
Who was your last one for you? Who was your the analyst that you did?
Well, I had a lot of different analysts, but I believe the day of that game, I was working with Ahmad Rashad, and Ahmad and I used to have a tremendous time calling games because often we had a tail end or close to tail end game, and sometimes they would get out of hand, and I would just simply set Ahmad up and let him go. And he had some amazing dissertations, including how to stay warm on a Vikings sideline without Bud Grant seeing you staying warm, and various other riffs of that nature. Ahmad was a tremendous expert commentator to work with me.
I could talk with you forever, Jim. Please come back. Please come back.
I'll come back forever.
I appreciate I appreciate that. The Fight Game with Jim Lampley, next episode airing Wednesday at 11 p.m. on HBO. Then, of course, get Canelo Alvarez versus Triple G, number 2, on September the 15th on HBO pay-per-view. Good to see you, Jim Lampley.
Thank you very much, Rich.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern on Audience.